Hello, everybody. This is a second part in a two-part series about our recent trip to the Hogeweyk village, which many people call the dementia village, which is in just right outside of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And it's a phenomenal concept that really proves the fact without risk, there's no life, and that we can make a difference in caregiving. We can make the journey better, particularly for that village, for people who have a form of dementia, to allow them to continue living their life to the fullest. And I'm Julie Steinbacher. I am an elder law and caregiving attorney, and I also am on here because I've journeyed with my mom and other family members through caregiving and know how hard that is. And I'm also the owner of a coaching group that helps attorneys and have the lives and practices that they deserve. And it was one of my lifelong dreams to go to this village. And 20 of us were able to, fly over and spend some time. I'm here with my daughter, Cortney, who is a CPA, who's also been on these caregiver journeys with us. And this podcast, Hey Woman, is dedicated to my mom, who we used to always call Woman. And when we would see her, first in her apartment or talk to her on the phone, we'd say, Hey Woman. And she always really loved that. So, we want to talk about, being at the dementia village, and we were able to physically be there. And it's what people have to understand when you're listening is that it's a real village. Like you walk in, there's houses that people live in by lifestyles. So they divide people up by lifestyle. So if you lived in a more rural area and you like meat and potatoes typically as a meal, you're going to live with people like that. If you lived more like in the city of Amsterdam and maybe you have more varied tastes and you're going to want variety in the food that you eat, there's a lifestyle for that. And so they have, different lifestyles. Also, they think about socioeconomic status, and, they work with families to decide what somebody's lifestyle. So they're trying to, match up their lives. And then they live in these homes, and there's a restaurant and a pub and a grocery store and a theater, and it's all real. It's how they care, is by just helping them continue to live. And Courtney, my daughter, was able to be on that trip. Also, my son, who I thought was really important. He's wants to be an elder law and estate planning attorney. I thought it was really important that he understood that concept and that mind shift.
I think it's something that you don't really get until you see. And so we're doing our best. And so this is the second part of a two-part series. And so if you haven't listened to the last episode, I really encourage you to go back, because we take a deep dive into the village and the key people who are involved in making that what it is. But I think, we talked a lot in the last episode about the mindset, and it is so different. The mindset of risk and life and tolerance and how they feel about things versus how we do it here. And so I think, we want to continue on and share some of the wonderful things that we learned while we were there. And so one of the next things that we learned while we were there was really about medication.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was stark. They talked about the fact that in the U.S., somebody who is in skilled nursing has about 16 medications. Now, this is really specific to somebody with a diagnosis of some form of dementia. And a lot of those medications, could be medications that are holdovers, and we'll talk about that they've just been on a long time and nobody's kind of discontinued them. Did they matter? We'll talk about that as far as in my mom's circumstance, who didn't have dementia, but kind of the same thing. But then also we're adding medicines because maybe there's behaviors or something going on, and we're trying to make sure we're trying to combat, whatever that symptom is or anything we're dealing with. And in the dementia village, the average person's on 4.
Which is quite the difference.
It is.
And I think goes to show what their commitment is to thinking through how a person is really living their life and what are we trying to solve, and how do we solve that differently? So instead of solving it by adding a medication that might not react well with other medications that they're on, are there lifestyle adjustments? Or, I think so often we put people on sleeping medications, sleep aids, different things like that. Even if it's not a prescribed sleep aid, we're like, oh, like they could have a melatonin, right? Or like, some sort of like natural vitamin or different thing like that. And it's like, we talked a lot in the last episode about maybe they just need to be more active.
Right.
Right. So, they say that they don't have the issues that we see with, people not sleeping through the night because they're doing things during the day, right? We're not bubble wrapping them. And I think, thinking through things like that, and is there a way to get to the same outcome without prescribing something different, is a really big mindset shift and a different way to think about things.
Yeah, and so you certainly have that, Eloy and Iris, who we met with and just were wonderful, wonderful hosts, really kind of talked about in the U.S. what we do is we bring stuff to people. And that doesn't matter if we're in an institutional setting or even at home. We often do that. We bring it to them because we don't want them to fall. We don't want them to be safe. We're there, they're not bringing it to them. People are getting up and getting it themselves. And so much of what you talked about, it's true that some of the medications are to make sure that people are sleeping because they're not sleeping. And they don't need that there because the people have walked around all day.
Right.
That stuff hasn't been brought to them. They've gotten up, went to the grocery store, helped cook a meal. They're tired, and so they sleep better. And that sounds very simplistic, but I think what I want people to really hear in this situation is there's data that supports like proof of concept. Like
right.
it does, the fact that they're on 4 medicines because these people have the same level of dementia as what we would see in the U.S. It's just that they're walking around, and I think it is part of a cultural thing in the U.S. We often want to solve problems with medicines, and they're not doing that there, but they're getting to the underlying concern. So I think that it's that symptom, but. Or responding to that symptom, I'm going to put a medicine so that person doesn't act out. I'm going to put a medicine so that person can sleep. But also, one of the things I learned with my mom, caregiving for my mom, and this was really through hospice and palliative care that was able to really help me and change, really profoundly change how much my mom could live her life and how much of a burden it was to caregive, was simply looking at her list of medicines that she was on, and it was long, and say, are these medicines still serving her?
And I think that's such an interesting question to like really talk about because, sometimes they're prescribed at a time when you're trying to fix a specific ailment, right?
Mm-hmm. And they made sense.
And they made sense. And I also think sometimes the way that, medicine is done in the U.S. and I don't know as much about like the medical system in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, but Nan had so many different doctors, and I think there's a hesitation sometimes that all of the doctors were well-meaning, but one doctor isn't going to like remove a medicine that another doctor prescribed. Mm-hmm. And so it's like they have this team-based approach, but there's no like captain.
Right.
To make sure that the medicines that maybe once were prescribed are no longer needed anymore. Because what are we actually trying to solve? Because as a diagnosis continues on, right, there are changes that are happening. And as somebody's moving through that journey, a risk that wasn't tolerable a couple of years ago is creating this other issue of, so like when I think about like Nan and like the Eliquis, right? Like it's like the best example. When she was on Eliquis, it was because she had AFib. And we were really trying to solve that issue. And so it was the right.
It prevents stroke. There's no doubt. Like, I mean, her AFib wasn't horrendous,
right?
But there's no doubt that if she presented as a 55-year-old female and she was, the cardiologist said, "Oh, we don't want you to have a stroke. You should be on Eliquis, and you're not falling and everything." There's no doubt that she should have been prescribed it.
Right.
But now she's, an 80-year-old with a dropped foot who is falling and we're having to take her to the hospital because what if she hit her head? And so we have to look at, in that circumstance, and she hasn't had an issue with her AFib or touched her medicine for years with that. Is that heart issue, which hasn't progressed, should that make her lung issue, which has progressed, worse?
Right.
And so no, the answer is no. The answer can be different for every family, though. I mean, I think the most important thing is that for her, the whole hard part of going in an ambulance, going through the x-rays, sitting in an emergency room that was too busy, and really wasn't outfitted for her, that wasn't worth, that experience was not at all okay, given the fact that I'm just taking Eliquis for something that's probably not going to happen. And at this point in time isn't my primary thing. And so in her circumstance, and I think this happens in the Netherlands kind of by practice, they're coming with the idea of, let's look at the person today in a more more place, and let's get rid of some of these. Now, I do think that it happens in the U.S. At least it happened for mom, like as part of palliative care and hospice care, to say, let's really look at the symptoms and where we are today. Now, in order to do that, we have to be accepting where we are today.
Right.
So we also do have to have people who communicate, because I know mom had been in the hospital once, and the doctor did discontinue the Eliquis, and like her cardiologist went, like, just blew up about it. And in that circumstance, like, I had some personal knowledge of, her illness, what that really meant. I kind of knew a little bit about it. And, I don't mean as an attorney, please know. And I don't mean any disrespect, but I knew a little bit about it because I had walked the same journey and knew the pros and cons. And when I looked at my mom, it just didn't make any sense to me to have this person go through that. So, I think that's one of the things that we all should be doing, is looking at the medicines of the person that we're caring for today, and ask, if there is a quarterback, it's probably a primary care physician, where they have the knowledge where you can say, does this make sense? Or try to get a referral to palliative care. And we talked about that in another episode, and have somebody who their job is to come in and say, given where we are today and the symptoms that we want to control, what makes the most sense? And so I think, getting rid of those medicines, and that's not the only medicine. We were able to get rid of quite a few of mom's medicines. And, and we found that, like, some were counteracting each other. We found some where she was taking 3 different medicines, and today they make it into one for her, lung disease. And that was a lot easier. So instead of her having to, like, puff in 3 different times, she only had to do it once. And that ended up being really, really good. So I think for, again, what we're, our trip to the dementia village, really what we're trying to do is to say, well, what could we take out of that and make actionable? And I think medicines are a huge thing. I think we need to think about why somebody on medicine, and can we deal with that some other way? Can we have them live life? Can we have them walk? Can we have them do things? We certainly did that with my father-in-law. He had vascular dementia, also called multi-infarct. And one of the best things to do with that was have him walk. And he really made it a long time without having to have any behavioral medicines or, sleeping most of the night. And I think those walks were really helpful with that. And so, can we get rid of some of the symptoms and not use the medicine? But then also, can we look at where somebody is today and say, do they even need that medicine today? Is that the primary focus? And so I think reducing medicines all around. And I would add to that, as a final thing, there's a monetary component in here.
Yeah, there is. And I think we'd be remiss not to talk about that. Some of these medicines are really expensive. Mm-hmm. And, caregiving, especially if the journey is long, there can really be a financial component. And so if you're able to reduce the costs on medicines, maybe you're able to, one, just save money. Maybe you're able to reallocate some of that money into something that's making a different kind of difference in their life and is making it seem better.
Yeah, and see, they don't have that in the Netherlands, so they don't, that's paid for, by the government. But in the U.S., that's a real consideration, and we have people who are worrying about, could they buy better food if they didn't have to buy those medicines? Do they have the best care? And, those formularies change. It's a very confusing thing. And so I certainly am not suggesting that we shouldn't be on medicines that we really need to be because of the money. But I am suggesting that it's another reason to really look at today. Are all these medicines serving me well? Because if I could get rid of some of them, one, the other ones are less likely to interact with each other. We also might be saving a good amount of money. Some of the medicines that we even talked about are quite costly. And even if you have Medicare, in some states, there's going to be some more supplements for those things. Like in my state, the PACE program is a great program, and Mom actually was on the PACE program, and that was really, really helpful. But not every state has that. Also, wouldn't be a reason to keep her on anything just because she wasn't paying as much for it. So, yeah, I think that's one of the things that kind of came out of our time at the Dementia Village as we, as attorneys and social workers, people who work in the offices, sat down and talked about it. We had decided that we really should be talking to families about this, and we also talked about really creating a backup plan in case the caregiver is not available. And when I talk to my clients about this, I always tell them they need two plans. They need the temporary plan, and then they need the more permanent one. And I talk about, actually, Court, when I was raising you and your siblings, I had both. So if something happened to your dad and I, there's no doubt that Nana was the temporary plan. There's no doubt. She was the one that would have picked you guys up from school, taken you home, fed you, loved you up, and for some temporary thing would have been your shelter. And so we knew that. But we also knew that there was three of you. And I'm not sure, if we had passed away, and this is what we'd call a testamentary guardian in people's wills and estate plans. I'm not sure Mom could have done that long term. And so we picked other people. When you're caregiving for somebody, I suggest to you that you have to have both. You have to have, let's say you're caregiving for your mom or you're caregiving for your spouse. You have to know if you were in a car accident tomorrow, who's going to be that temporary plan? Who's going to be the person that goes to the house? Can they get in? Do they know the 5 things they need to know about what not to do? Do they know those things? Can they get there? And then, a more long-term plan. And sometimes that might be looking into a facility. And I know a lot of times when I work with families, they say to me, I don't ever want my loved one to go to a nursing home. And I get that, and I hear it. But sometimes we can't control life. If you pass away, that might be, or something could happen that it's even temporary. So your loved one could fall and break a hip, or have a stroke. And so I really, really encourage people to look around at facilities in your local area and decide what ones would be the ones that you would like better than the others, so that you're not standing in a hospital room and they come in with a list and they say, where would you want to go? You at least have seen some of them and thought, well, this one's better than that one for my mom or for this diagnosis, because there's good and bad in everything. And so, creating that plan, you also can read a lot about them online. Of course, everybody today goes to Google reviews, right? But there is also the CMS website, which is CMS is, a government agency that deals with Medicare and Medicaid. They do have a good rating on their website where you can go and kind of check out a facility. The number one thing I would want to check out for my loved one if something was going on with them that involved them needing rehab, I would want to check out what their discharge rate is. And so our advice to you, I don't want to get too far down, is, have a backup plan. I don't know, do you have a backup plan for Minnie?
I, hope that Fun Uncle DJ kind of comes through for the dog. But I think, that's a real part of caregiving too, which is, and they talked about it at the Hogeweyk, sometimes people bring their pet with them.
Right.
And that is like such a real part. So my dog Minnie has been with me for 5 years. So I got her when she was 8 weeks old. And, if something...
A COVID dog.
Yes, she is a COVID puppy and has all of the fun separation anxiety and things that come with that. But, if something happened to me, something would have to... I would need a plan for the dog. And, I joke, but DJ would take her and make sure that she was okay and that she was still... hopefully living the life that she was accustomed with her bark boxes and different things like that. But, I think...
Well, in your estate plan, you could set up a trust for her. In many states, you're allowed to do that, just so you know.
Yes. Yeah. And so I could. But I also think, it's important for caregiving, for people who have pets. So, Nan didn't have pets, but she loved Minnie. And so, bringing Minnie to go see Nan was always really important. But people that moved into the Hogeweyk, sometimes their pets moved in with them. And sometimes after a while, they removed the pets because it wasn't the best place for the pet or the person. And honestly, for Nan, she loved dogs. And so, just Minnie coming to see her just for, a little bit was enough for her. She could have never have... given a dog what the dog needed, but those little visits were really enough. But some people do have pets, and so if you think about facilities, will the facility allow a pet? Do you need a separate plan for the pet? And you kind of talked about plans, but they're different. There's a couple of different plans that need to be made, right? There's oh my gosh, what happens to the caregiver if something happens to the caregiver. There's also, oh my gosh, we're standing in a hospital and we need to be discharged to a rehab. But I think the underlying theme really is sitting down and making sure that you have good notes about things that you've learned. But it's also making those decisions before you have to. So it's doing the research and understanding what your options are so that when you're standing there confronted with a list, you already know what decision you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're collecting those facts and informations in a situation where you're not in a crisis, because it's so hard in a crisis to be having the time, because you're dealing with whatever crisis is going on. Yeah. And I think too, you should tell the people who, your plan depends on. So Fun Uncle DJ should probably know that. I think your friend Michaela probably knows she's probably the temporary,
She is. And that's a really good point. So, Minnie is boarded at a daycare right now. And, Michaela and I have been friends for, over 10 years since we were freshmen in high school. And if the daycare called me right now and somebody had to go get the dog, Michaela would go get her.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think too, this is a whole, we kind of got into this pet thing, which is what do I do with a pet? But I want, people to know this is really important. There's actually somebody I consider a friend of mine, Julie McCormick, who's an attorney from Butler, Pennsylvania, and she does, four-legged family members and doing estate planning for them. And that's important, who's going to take the animals. So where's the person going to go? Where are the people going to go? And, in my career, I have done trusts for parrots and parakeets and all kinds of different things, but those things, I think it's important for people to realize those things only happen because there's a plan, because somebody did some research, made some decisions, and had a plan. And then it doesn't matter what we talk about when we're in that crisis, it's easier because we take out the plan and we follow it. It may not be perfect, things may have changed, but at least we have a starting point. And so I think that's really important for us to be thinking about. So, our advice is, make that backup plan, both temporary and permanent. And, you're just adding, bring the dog in there into that plan or the cat. And there are facilities that do allow animals and there's some that don't. And so that could be really, really important. The other thing is, consider alternative methods to care aside from medications. And actually, in our last episode, we talked a little bit about that because we talked about music therapy, or just the whole power of music. But there's also other things that you can do without using medicines that are really popular today and, could be really helpful for our loved ones.
Yeah, and I think, too, when we think about, like, other therapies, there's music therapies. There's also, it was really interesting to me when we were walking around, a couple of the gentlemen had weights on their legs. And so that was a better signal to their brain that they were walking and they were moving. And so I think things like that, or weighted blankets, or, there's all kinds of really neat things that are out that with just a little bit of research you can kind of find and might give you the same outcome that a medicine would have given.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, the weighted blanket is such a simple thing. And obviously you have to really watch, like, how much it's weighted. But I know for myself, going through a period of time that, I wasn't able to sleep as well. Right away, my doctor prescribed, was like, oh, well, I'll be happy to give you, a sleep medicine. And then she proceeded to say, well, this really won't harm you. And, I thought her having to say that to me, I was like, I don't know. But a weighted blanket was, one of the things that really helped me kind of get through that time. And so I think it's, important for us to be thinking about what are those other things short of medicine. And, sometimes it's not offered, but if you ask your medical professional, they'll tell you things. And I think it's sometimes we forget. They do this day in and day out. They don't remember who they've told. It seems like common sense to them, but it might be like, oh, I've never heard of that, you know, and that's really helpful. So I think the other thing on our list is if your loved one becomes aggressive, consider reasons that this might be happening. So examples, there could be a medical condition underlying it, like a urinary tract infection. It also can just be, frustration from not being able to express your needs. We talked in another episode about maybe it's because they have onions, and the person doesn't like onions. But we really want to be thinking about when we see a behavior, taking a step back and trying to figure out. And I think they did a great job of this at the village. They did a great job in saying, well, why is that happening? What's around the environment? Who's around that person? And some of it, I think, one of the other things we learned is they also put a lot of time into training their caregivers. And I think this, we saw it.
I think one of the things this makes me think about is holiday decoration. So, here in the U.S., we're told that sometimes people who have a diagnosis of dementia, holiday decorations can be really jarring and really upsetting. So I remember asking Iris, I was like, do you guys decorate for Christmas? And she was like, of course we do. And, it's so interesting, just a different perspective. And when I think about, Nan didn't have dementia, but like if she did, not decorating for Christmas would have actually been really upsetting. Mm-hmm. And so, I could have been doing the right thing in my head by not decorating, but that could have caused a behavior, right? Because I wasn't getting her nativity scene out. Mm-hmm. And it's, when I think about, after she passed, we were cleaning out her place, and one of the things I said is, I wanted her nativity scene. Because I remember being a little kid, and I remember unwrapping all of it, and you had to dust it, and then you put each little thing out, and it was this whole afternoon activity that you did with her. And so, it made sense to me that even though she didn't have a diagnosis of dementia, if she had, and she was having a behavior, and it was around that time, maybe it's because she thought that the nativity scene should,
Right.
And so I think,
or if it wasn't there, maybe she was missing it and wanted to talk about Christmas.
Right. And she just didn't know how to express that. And so I think, going to the Hogeweyk is not something that everybody can do. It was such a neat experience. And so I hope that over these last 2 episodes, we've been able to share some different things that you can think about as you're caregiving for your loved one, whether they have a diagnosis of dementia or not. I think it's just so important because it changes the mindset and changes the way that we think about care, and that it really comes down to It's about the person that you're caring for. And so that things that worked for Nan aren't going to work for other people. Things that worked for you and I aren't going to work for other people. And so we're here and we're sharing kind of like the raw, unfiltered versions of what we went through and what that emotional journey looked like. But you have to figure out what works for you. And so I think, kind of wrapping up this 2-episode part of it's about the person and it's about having a plan and making sure that your plan works for your life and your person so that it can make caregiving easier, because when you're standing in an emergency, you already know what you need to do. And it really matters at the end of the day what's best for that person. So I want to thank people for listening in, and you can find us on TikTok, on Instagram, at the Hey Woman Podcast, on Facebook. If you're looking for an attorney who is more forward thinking, if you think that you might need legal help, the Planning and Protecting website is there to find a resource in your local area. And we hope that if you're caregiving and you feel a lack of support, that this podcast is kind of able to give that to you. Caregiving is such an intricate journey, and we understand that there are differences in our journeys, but at the end of the day, we're all kind of going through it together.
Absolutely.